Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief recap of my lecture on Epicurean hedonism as a part of the larger part of the History of Ethics lecture series, which I'm developing. So in my lecture on Epicurean hedonism, I again drop back and sort of develop the context for understanding hedonism in general as a ethical philosophy grounded in the metaphysics of materialism, i.e. the claim that the nature of reality is purely physical or purely material, and that certain animals within this material or physical reality can, for whatever reason, experience their lives, and goodness and badness come into existence through the experience of sentient beings. And in particular, human beings combine sentience with conceptual abilities via the abstract mind, and so the very ideas of good and bad come into existence through the sentient experience of conceptualizing creatures like human beings. This gives rise to a tradition which I've represented by looking at the thoughts of two philosophers, the early Cyrenaic philosopher Aristippus, and then most recently the later philosopher from the island of Samos, who moved to Athens and started his own school eventually there, Epicurus. And I tried to describe the way in which Epicurus refined the early sort of sensualist philosophy that Aristippus had offered us. And Epicurus did this in part because he was less skeptical about the future than Aristippus. Aristippus had a lot of skepticism about the future, and so his philosophy is very much sort of focused on living now while you can and enjoying what you can of life now and maximizing your opportunities for pleasures and maximizing the intensity of the pleasures that you get to experience. However, for Epicurus, who's less skeptical about the future, while not a fool, not foolish enough to think that the future is guaranteed, if you're planning or hoping even to have a nice long life, and you take this attitude of thinking that life is to be enjoyed, you may want to minimize your investment in what we've called in these lectures the positive pleasures, i.e. those that result from the positive presence of specific urges and desires. You may instead want to, as the Epicureans advise, invest in the negative pleasures, i.e. the pleasures that can be experienced despite the absence of specific urges and desires. And amongst those negative pleasures that were important and discussed by Epicurus, we see him talk about, cultivating your health, cultivating your financial stability, cultivating your intellectual enjoyment of existence, and maybe more important than anything else, cultivating trusting and long-lasting and stable relationships. And for all of these, putting the work in, investing some pain wisely in order to experience a higher quality, longer lasting pleasure, set of pleasures associated with good health and mental cultivation and financial stability and good, lasting, trusting relationships in your life. And if you could do this, combine that with sort of knowing thyself, again, always a theme of ancient ethics, and learning to differentiate between the natural desires that are unnecessary and the natural desires that are necessary. You want to moderate your life, especially with regard to the unnecessary natural desires. For example, the desire for sex, totally natural, but not necessary. Instead, perhaps you should invest in literally making love, making relationships that have greater intimacy and greater trust and greater levels of vulnerability, which would then require you to sort of continue to peel the onion in your own life psychologically and emotionally. And so in this way, you give yourself something that you need, which is intimacy, and something that you need, which is relationships in your life if you're going to try to have an enjoyable human existence, rather than just the exciting and fun and enjoyable, maybe pleasurable new sexual experiences. You instead sort of tone that down, moderate it. Epicurus would never say that the pleasures are bad inherently, but that some pleasures definitely are more wise to pursue than others. And in particular, we might use this language of hedonistic scholars to say the negative pleasures are more wise to pursue than the positive pleasures of the Cyrenaics. So again, know thyself, minimize and simplify your life, and try to pursue the pleasures that would lead to a sort of a higher quality, less intense, but longer lasting enjoyment of existence. Also, remember to be very careful about what Epicurus called kenodoxia, or superstitious beliefs, sort of empty opinions, and the empty desires that often accompany such empty opinions or superstitions. Do not spend a lot of your life in pursuit of things like immortality or freedom from retribution of the gods, that for a materialist metaphysician like Epicurus, if we just go with the sense evidence of the physical world, we would be bringing unnecessary anxiety into our lives by pursuing immortality and freedom from retribution of the gods, which don't seem to be, based on the senses, the evidence of the senses, something worth putting a lot of worry into. In fact, worry, stress, anxiety are some of the, maybe some of the things that tend to take away the enjoyment of existence more than anything. If we're relatively fortunate enough in life to have our basic needs met, then what we want to try to do is live our life in such a way so as to minimize the pains in our bodies, certainly the hangovers and the ill health that can sometimes be the result of more risk-taking behaviors. And we also want to cultivate a kind of a freedom from stress in our minds, freedom from fear, unnecessary irrational fears, and freedom from anxieties that often are the result of opinions that are ungrounded in the evidence. And if we were to know ourselves in this way and cultivate these negative pleasures, we could perhaps live a life that is unknown, admittedly, maybe not about fame, not about power, not about money, but a life that has a kind of a deep contentment to it, a long-lasting potential for contentment and enjoyment and pleasure of a higher quality than the sensualist pleasures recommended by the Cyrenaics. So we live unknown. We still try to be just to one another, not because we believe, based on the evidence, that there's some moral duty to do so, but because we think that that is most likely to lead us to communities where we can enjoy our lives and where other people can enjoy our lives. And since we get so much of our own enjoyment from our relationships with other people, we really have a lot to gain by helping other people enjoy their lives as well. And so live unknown and be unjust, cultivate the negative pleasures through a kind of a wise understanding of existence, know thyself, and learn to differentiate the desires that you have from those that are more important and those that are less important and to be avoided. Renounce certain things that are just too risky to touch, even though at first they may seem very enjoyable. And in this way, we might, he says somewhat ironically, live like gods amongst people, in that we would live serene and tranquil existences where we have experienced ataraxia, which is a kind of a freedom from pain in the body and freedom from trouble in the mind. And this has been my brief review of my lecture on Epicurean hedonism. I hope you're enjoying your lives.